The air was a sterile whisper, filtered and chilled to the precise temperature that prevented condensation on the observation glass. It carried no scent, no dust, no memory of the world outside. Elian breathed it in, a measured inhalation, just as he had been taught. The rhythm was a metronome counting down the final moments of his life as he knew it. His reflection stared back from the polished chrome steel wall of his sanitation chamber, a stranger sculpted into perfection. The white silk of his ceremonial tunic was a second skin, cool and unforgiving, its seams tracing the lines of a body honed for presentation. They had told him he was beautiful. They had told him he was fortunate. They had told him he was complete, a perfect half waiting for its counterpart. He was none of those things. He was a product, meticulously assembled from a genetic blueprint, his environment calibrated to produce a specific outcome. An omega of unparalleled purity, destined for the alpha of House Valerius, for Rhys. The name was a concept, a data file filled with projections of genetic compatibility, social standing, and physical perfection. He had seen the hollows, of course. Rhys Valerius, with his sun-gold hair and eyes the color of a clear summer sky, the heir to the most powerful genetic dynasty in the northern stratum. His scent profile, catalogued and analyzed, was said to be a symphony of sun-warmed citrus and ancient amber, a perfect harmonic to Elian's own suppressed essence of moonflower and winter frost. A fated mate. The term was clinical, a biological imperative sanctioned and enforced by the Directorate. It was the foundation of their ordered society, the mechanism that ensured the strength of bloodlines and the stability of power. To be fated was to be chosen not by chance, but by destiny encoded in their very cells, a profound, unbreakable bond. He touched the cool metal of the wall, his fingertips leaving no print. He was not an asset, he was not an experiment. He repeated the words, a silent mantra that had lost its meaning through 1,000 repetitions. He was a promise, a living treaty. The door hissed open, a soft exhalation of pressurized air. A handler, her face a serene mask, bowed her head. Unit 734, it is time. Elian did not respond. Unit 734 was his designation, the name etched onto his file. Elian was the name he whispered to himself in the dark, a secret, fragile thing. He followed the handler down a corridor of luminous white, the floor glowing softly beneath his feet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of their movements. This was the antechamber, the final space of his cloistered existence. Beyond the next door was the presentation hall, and beyond that, a future that had been written for him before his conception. He felt a tremor on his hands, a flicker of rebellion in his own placid biology. Fear. It was an unsanctioned emotion, a system error. He focused on his breathing, forcing the metronome back into its steady rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The great doors at the end of the hall were carved from petrified wood, a stark, organic contrast to the sterile world around them. They were a symbol of the Valerius family's ancient lineage, a reminder that before the Directorate's cold science, there was only nature. The handler pressed her palm to a panel, and the doors swung inward without a sound, revealing a space that stole his carefully metered breath. The presentation hall was a cathedral of glass and light. Sunlight, unfiltered and raw, poured through a crystalline ceiling, illuminating a vast, circular room. In the center stood a small group of people, their dark, formal attire a stark contrast to his own white, and among them, one figure burned brighter than the rest. Rhys Valerius. He was even more perfect than the hollows. The light caught in his golden hair, creating a halo effect. He turned, and his sky-blue eyes found Elian's. A smile, practiced and radiant, graced his lips. The air shifted, no longer sterile. A scent, faint but undeniable, reached him. Citrus and amber. It was pleasant. It was precisely what he had been conditioned to expect. It felt constructed. Rhys took a step forward, his movements fluid and confident. He was the center of this universe, and Elian was the moon being drawn into his orbit. "Elian," he said, his voice smooth and warm, exactly as the vocal analysis had predicted. He used the name, the secret name, a calculated intimacy. Elian inclined his head, the gesture of submission practiced to perfection. His heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of his ribs. This was it, the culmination of his entire existence. He took a step forward, then another, crossing the threshold from his world into theirs. And then he saw him, standing in the shadow of a great pillar, almost outside the circle of light, was another man. He was taller than Rhys, broader in the shoulder, his presence a stark, quiet disruption. Where Rhys was all golden light, this man was cast in shadow and steel. His hair was black, catching the light not with a halo, but with the glint of obsidian. His eyes, when they met Elian's, were not the open sky, but the deep, starless grey of a winter storm. He was not smiling. He stood with a stillness that was not serene, but coiled, a predator at rest. A scent, entirely alien and uncatalogued, cut through the curated air. It was not a symphony. It was a raw, primal chord of ozone after a lightning strike, of cold stone, and something wild, something dangerous. It bypassed Elian's conditioning, his training, his very control, and struck a resonant frequency deep within his bones. It was a question and a command, all at once. The man did not move, did not speak. He only watched. The elder Valerius, a man with a face like carved granite, gestured toward Rhys. "Elian, may I present my son and heir, Rhys?" But Elian's gaze was trapped, held captive by the storm-grey eyes in the shadows. He felt a pull, a terrifying, magnetic force that had nothing to do with fate and everything to do with a choice he didn't know he had. Rhys's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He followed Elian's gaze, and his expression tightened, the warmth in his eyes dimming to a cool frost. "And my brother, Kyle," he said, his tone clipped, dismissive. Kyle. The name was unfamiliar, a spare, an afterthought. But in that moment, as Kyle's gaze held his, Elian understood with a chilling certainty that the script had been wrong. The metronome of his life had just shattered. The carefully constructed world of white walls and sterile air was about to be broken, and the sound would be deafening. The formal introductions were a blur of sound and motion that Elian observed from a great distance. He performed his part flawlessly, his body moving through the pre-programmed gestures of deference and grace. He inclined his head to Lord Valerius, murmured the correct pleasantries to Rhys, and kept his eyes lowered, a perfect portrait of demure compliance. But his senses were screaming. The curated scent of Rhys, the citrus and amber, felt like a thin veneer over the charged atmosphere. Beneath it, a storm was brewing, and its epicenter was the silent figure still lingering at the edge of the room. Kyle. His presence was a gravitational anomaly, warping the smooth fabric of the ceremony. Every nerve ending Elian possessed was aware of him, of his stillness, of the untamed scent that was a low, constant hum beneath the polite conversation. It was a scent of defiance, a scent of the world beyond the white walls. When the formal part of the presentation concluded, Lord Valerius led the small party toward a private salon for refreshments. A chance to acclimatize, he had said, his voice resonating with patriarchal authority. It was another test, another phase of the integration protocol. Elian walked beside Rhys, the designated space between them a chasm of unspoken expectations. Rhys spoke of his love for stellar cartography, of a recent acquisition of an antique star chart from the pre-directorate era. His words were smooth, polished, designed to put Elian at ease, to showcase a cultivated intellect. But Elian heard only the mechanics of it, the careful selection of topics deemed suitable for a first encounter. He was being managed, handled. The salon was opulent, a stark contrast to the minimalist grandeur of the presentation hall. Rich tapestries depicting ancient Valerius victories hung on dark wood walls. A fire, a real fire of burning logs, crackled in a vast stone hearth, releasing a scent of smoke and resin that was both alien and strangely comforting. It was a room that spoke of history, of power that was old and deeply rooted. Kale was already there, standing by the fire, one hand resting on the stone mantelpiece. He had not followed with the main group, but had simply appeared, as if he moved through the shadows of the estate at will. He held a glass of dark liquid, and the firelight danced on its surface, casting flickering patterns of red and gold across his severe face. Rhys's pleasant chatter faltered as he saw his brother, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Kyle, you rarely grace us with your presence at family functions." The words were light, but they carried a sharp, icy edge. Kale turned his head slowly, his grey eyes sweeping over Rhys before settling once again on Ilian. The look was not aggressive, not possessive. It was analytical. He was being weighed, measured, but by a scale Ilian did not understand. "I was curious," Kale said, his voice a low baritone, deeper than Rhys's, with a rougher texture. It was the sound of gravel, not silk. The directorate's finest work. I wanted to see it for myself. The insult was delivered with such cold precision that it took a moment to land. It, not him. Elian felt a flush of heat, a surge of unsanctioned anger. He was not a thing. He was not a piece of art to be appraised. Rhys stiffened, his perfect smile becoming a thin, hard line. "Elian is my intended. You will show him the respect due to his position." "Respect must be earned," Kale replied, taking a slow sip from his glass. He did not look away from Elian. "As must a position." The tension in the room became a physical presence, thick and suffocating. Lord Valerius, who had been speaking with an aide, turned, his face a thundercloud. "Kale, that is enough." Kale gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of obedience that felt like mockery. He turned his back to them, facing the fire once more, effectively dismissing them all. The conversation resumed, but the easy facade was shattered. Elian could feel Rhys's simmering fury beside him, a palpable heat that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He was offered a nutrient-rich beverage in a delicate crystal flute. He accepted it, his hands steady despite the tremor deep inside him. He was supposed to be focused on Rhys, on memorizing the cadence of his voice, the subtle shift in his scent that indicated his mood. He was supposed to be building the foundation of their fated bond. Instead, his entire being was oriented toward the silent, brooding figure by the fire. He was a black hole, absorbing all the light and warmth in the room, leaving only a cold, compelling emptiness. Later, when the initial meeting was over and he was being escorted to his new quarters, a suite of rooms far more luxurious than his sterile chamber, but a cage nonetheless, he had to pass a long, shadowed gallery. The walls were lined with portraits of Valerius ancestors, their stern faces judging him from behind layers of oil and varnish. He paused, ostensibly to admire a painting, but really to calm the frantic beating of his heart. "They are all liars." The voice came from the shadows beside him. Kyle stepped into a sliver of moonlight filtering through a high window. He was no longer in his formal attire, but in a simple, dark tunic that made him seem even larger, more imposing. "Every single one of them," Kyle continued, his gaze on the portraits, "they paint themselves as gods, as architects of destiny. They were pirates and warlords. They took what they wanted." He finally looked at Elian, and the intensity in his eyes was like a physical blow. The directorate simply gave them a more elegant vocabulary for their greed. Elian's conditioning screamed at him to retreat, to call for a handler, to report this unauthorized interaction. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But he stood his ground, rooted to the spot by a terrifying curiosity. "What do you want?" Elian's voice was a whisper, barely audible. Kyle stepped closer, invading his personal space, his scent of ozone and stone a dizzying storm. Elian's own suppressed scent, the moonflower and frost flickered, threatening to rise in response, a reflexive act of defiance. "I want you to open your eyes," Kale said, his voice low and urgent. "They have shown you a blueprint and told you it is a soul. They have given you a chemical equation and told you it is love. They have built you a beautiful cage and told you it is your destiny." He was so close now that Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze dropped to Elian's lips, then back to his eyes. For a terrifying second, Elian thought Kyle might touch him, an act that would be an unforgivable transgression. "Reese will give you comfort," Kale murmured, his voice laced with something that sounded like pity. "He will give you wealth and status. He will give you the life you were designed for." He paused, letting the words hang in the silent gallery. "But he will never give you the truth." Before Elian could process the words, before he could formulate a response, Kale stepped back, melting into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. He was gone. Elian was left alone in the gallery, his heart hammering against his ribs, the scent of a coming storm lingering in the air. The truth. The word echoed in the sudden silence. It was a foreign concept, a variable that had never been part of his equation. He looked at the portraits on the wall, at the painted lies of the Valerius ancestors, and for the first time he saw not gods, but men. And he felt a cold, terrifying thought begin to form, a crack in the foundation of his world. What if his own destiny was the greatest lie of all? The days that followed were a carefully orchestrated performance of courtship. Reese was a diligent suitor, adhering to every protocol the directorate had established for the bonding period. He sent Elian flowers, rare blossoms cultivated in zero-gravity environments, their beauty sterile and perfect. He brought him data crystals filled with classical music, the harmonies mathematically precise, devoid of passion. They walked in the estate's manicured gardens, where every leaf and petal was arranged in geometric perfection, a testament to the Valerius control over nature itself. Reese spoke, and Elian listened. He described the political landscape, the intricacies of managing their genetic assets, the future that awaited them as the ruling pair of the house. He was painting a picture of Elian's life, filling in the details of the gilded cage Kale had spoken of. "You will be the heart of this house," Rhys told him one afternoon, as they sat by a fountain whose waters danced in programmed, repeating patterns. "Your purity will secure our lineage for generations. It is a great honor, a great responsibility." Elian looked at their reflections in the water, the images wavering, distorting. He saw a golden prince and his pale, silent consort. An honor, a responsibility, not a life, not a choice. Kale remained a ghost, a phantom presence at the edge of his awareness. Elian never saw him, but he felt him. Sometimes, a scent of ozone would drift through an open window, a fleeting reminder of the storm. He would find a book left on a table in the library, a volume of forbidden pre-directorate poetry, its pages filled with messy, passionate words about freedom and rebellion. There was no note, no sign of who left it, but he knew. He read the poems in secret, the words igniting something dormant within him, a longing for a world he couldn't imagine. He was being tested, not just by the Valerius family and their protocols, but by the silent, watchful brother. Kale was not trying to woo him. He was trying to awaken him. The conflict between the two brothers simmered beneath the surface of the estate's placid routine. It was a war fought in silence, in glances, in the charged space between them. Rhys, for all his polished charm, grew increasingly possessive, his touches lingering a moment too long, his smile tightening whenever Elian's attention seemed to drift. He was shoring up his claim, asserting his ownership in the face of an unseen threat. One evening, a week after the presentation, Rhys took Elian to the Valerius Observatory. It was a magnificent structure, a dome of shimmering crystal at the highest point of the estate. Inside, a master console controlled a powerful telescope, its lens aimed at the star-dusted blackness of space. "I wanted to show you this," Rhys said, his voice softer than usual, a carefully crafted attempt at intimacy. He guided Elian to the console, his hand resting on the small of his back. "This is our legacy. We do not just rule a piece of land. We chart the heavens. We impose order on the chaos of the universe." He keyed in a command, and the telescope shifted, the view on the main screen resolving into a breathtaking nebula, a swirl of incandescent gas in shades of violet and crimson. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Rhys murmured, his breath warm against Elian's ear. "Perfect. Predictable. Its trajectory, its composition, all mapped, all understood." Elian stared at the image, at the cosmic dust cloud birthing new stars. He saw beauty, yes, but he also saw chaos, a wild, untamable fire. Rhys saw order. He saw data. They were looking at the same image and seeing two different universes. "What is out there?" Elian asked, his voice quiet. "Beyond the charted systems?" Rhys chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound. "Nothing of consequence. Unstable stars, rogue planets, emptiness. We focus on what matters, on what can be controlled." His hand tightened on Elian's back. "It is the same with bloodlines. We cultivate the strong, the pure. We eliminate the unpredictable elements. It is how we have survived. It is how we will prevail." The door to the observatory hissed open, and Kyle entered. He moved with a quiet confidence that was the antithesis of Rhys's curated grace. He ignored his brother completely, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Elian. "He shows you the stars he has put in a box," Kale said, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere. Ask him to show you a supernova. Ask him to show you a black hole. Ask him to show you something he cannot control." Rhys whirled around, his face contorted with a rage that shattered his perfect facade. "Get out, Kale. This is not your place, isn't it?" Kale took a slow step forward, his presence seeming to suck the very air from the room. "This place was built by our grandfather, a man who looked at the chaos and saw wonder, not a balance sheet. You have turned his legacy into a cage, just like everything else you touch." He stopped directly in front of them, so close that Elian was trapped between the two brothers, a focal point in their magnetic opposition. Rhys's scent was sharp now, the citrus turned acidic with anger. Kale's scent was a low, rumbling thunder, a promise of a storm about to break. "Elian is with me," Rhys snarled, his hand gripping Elian's arm tightly, pulling him back. The touch was painful, bruising, an act of possession, a claim. Elian flinched, not just from the pain, but from the raw, ugly emotion behind it. This was the reality beneath the polished surface, the iron fist in the velvet glove. Kale's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in their grey depths. He looked at Rhys's hand on Elian's arm, and his expression became glacial. "You are hurting him." "He is mine to handle," Rhys shot back, his voice trembling with fury. In that moment, something inside Elian snapped. The conditioning, the training, the years of placid obedience, it all fractured. He was not a thing to be handled. He was not a prize to be fought over. He pulled his arm from Rhys's grasp, a sharp, decisive movement that surprised them both. The silence that followed was deafening. Elian stood between them, breathing heavily, his heart a wild drum. He looked at Rhys, at his handsome face twisted by rage and entitlement. Then he looked at Kale, at his severe, unreadable expression that held not possession, but a question, an invitation. He was standing on a precipice. Behind him was the known world, the safe, predictable, gilded cage that Rhys offered. Ahead of him was a terrifying abyss, an unknown future, represented by Kale's silent challenge. The choice was his. For the first time in his life, a choice was truly his. "Stop," Elian said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. It was a single word, but it held the weight of a lifetime of silence. Both brothers looked at him, startled. He had just torn up the script. He had deviated from the protocol. And in the quiet hum of the observatory, surrounded by the cold, distant light of caged stars, Elian felt the first terrifying thrill of freedom. It was a spark, and Kale's presence was the storm that would fan it into a flame. The aftermath of the confrontation in the observatory was a suffocating, controlled silence. Rhys retreated, his fury replaced by a cold, calculating distance. He treated Elian with a brittle, exaggerated courtesy that was more unnerving than his open anger. He was re-evaluating, recalibrating his approach. Elian was no longer a compliant asset. He was a malfunctioning component, and Rhys was deciding how to bring him back online. But the broken component had no intention of being repaired. The single word of defiance, "stop," had unlocked something within him. It was a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He felt awake. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vibrant, the silence of the estate more profound. He spent his days in the vast library, devouring the forbidden poetry Kale had left for him, then moving on to history, philosophy, anything that was not on his approved directorate curriculum. He was starving, and knowledge was the first real nourishment he had ever known. He learned of a world before the Directorate, a world of chaos, yes, but also of art, of passion, of unprogrammed, messy, beautiful humanity. He was not avoiding Greece, but he made no effort to seek him out. He was existing in a state of limbo, a quiet rebellion. He knew a reckoning was coming. He did not have to wait long. 2 nights after the observatory incident, he was awakened from a restless sleep by a faint sound. A click. The door to his suite had been unlocked. He sat up, his heart pounding, every nerve on high alert. The scent came first, a whisper of ozone and cold stone, cutting through the scentless, recycled air of his rooms. Kyle. He slipped out of bed, the cool floor a shock to his bare feet. He moved to the main sitting area of his suite. Kyle was standing by the window, a tall, dark silhouette against the moonlit gardens. He turned as Elian entered, his face half in shadow, unreadable. "You have made things difficult," Kyle said. It was not an accusation, but a statement of fact. "Reese is petitioning our father. He wants to accelerate the bonding. He claims you are unstable, that you require a firm hand to guide you back to your designated purpose." The words were cold, clinical, but Elian heard the underlying warning. A firm hand, a euphemism for breaking his will, for forcing the bond before his nascent independence could take root. "My purpose," Elian repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "To be a vessel for the Valerius bloodline." "That is how they see you," Kale confirmed, his voice low. "It is how they see everyone, as a collection of genetic traits to be managed and exploited. Reese believes in the system because he is its perfect product. He cannot comprehend anything outside of it." Kyle took a step closer, and another. He moved with a deliberate, predatory grace that made the space between them feel electric. Elian stood his ground, his fear mingling with a strange, exhilarating anticipation. "I offered you the truth," Kyle said, his storm-grey eyes boring into Elian's. "But the truth is not a gift. It is a weapon, and once you hold it, you must be prepared to use it." "What is the truth, Kale?" Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The real truth. Why are you doing this?" Kale stopped just a breath away from him. His scent was overwhelming now, a force of nature that made Elian's head spin. His own suppressed scent, the moonflower and frost, was stirring, rising to the surface in a desperate, instinctual answer to the storm. It was a terrifying loss of control. "Because my mother was like you," Kyle said, his voice dropping, losing its hard edge for the first time, revealing a raw, jagged wound beneath. "She was not a fated match for my father. She was a political prize from a rival house. She had a spirit like a wildfire. They tried to extinguish it, to shape her into a perfect Valerius matriarch. They failed." He paused, and the silence was heavy with grief. "The system declared her unstable, genetically incompatible. They sedated her into compliance. She spent the last 10 years of her life in a scented room, smiling at walls, her fire gone. I watched them do it. I was a child. I was helpless." The confession hung in the air, a devastating revelation. This wasn't about power or rivalry with his brother. It was about a ghost. It was about a promise made by a helpless boy to a broken mother. "They will do the same to you," Kyle said, his voice regaining its steel. "Once the bond is forced, once you have produced an heir, they will trim away any part of you that does not fit their design. Your curiosity, your defiance, your spirit. They will medicate it, condition it, until all that is left is a beautiful, empty shell." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from Elian's face. Elian could feel the heat from his fingertips. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. "I will not let that happen," Kale vowed, his voice a low, fierce growl. And then he did the unthinkable. He took the final step, closing the infinitesimal space between them. His hand came up, not to strike, not to caress, but to cup the back of Elian's neck. The touch was a brand, a shock that jolted through Elian's entire nervous system. It was firm, possessive, yet strangely steadying. His thumb rested on the sensitive scent gland just below Elian's ear. It was the most intimate of alpha gestures, a prelude to a claim, an act of absolute dominance. Elian's breath hitched. His mind screamed in protest, a chorus of directorate warnings about unauthorized contact, about the sanctity of the fated bond. But his body betrayed him. It leaned into the touch, craving the strength, the reality of it. "Reese wants to own you," Kyle murmured, his lips close to Elian's ear, his breath a warm rush against his skin. "He wants to put you in a display case. I am offering you something else." "What?" Elian breathed, his eyes fluttering shut. "A chance. A choice." His thumb pressed gently against the gland, and Elian's scent, the moonflower and frost, bloomed into the air, sharp and unrestrained, a desperate plea. Kyle inhaled deeply, his own scent of ozone and stone surging in response, wrapping around Elian, enveloping him in the heart of the storm. It was not a gentle mingling. It was a collision, a claiming of territory. "They will come for you in the morning." Kale's voice was a rough whisper against his skin. "My father has agreed. The bonding will be forced. This is your last chance to choose: servitude in a gilded cage, or a war you may not survive." He pulled back slightly, his hand still holding Elian captive. His grey eyes were blazing with a fierce, terrible light. Choose Elian. The choice was not a choice. It was an inevitability. It had been since the moment Elian first saw him standing in the shadows, a quiet disruption in a world of perfect, sterile lies. To go with Reese was a slow death. To go with Kale was a terrifying leap into an unknown darkness. But it was a leap. It was life. "I choose the war," Elian said, his voice shaking but clear. A flicker of something, relief, triumph, something fiercely protective, crossed Kale's face. His hand tightened on Elian's neck, a gesture of finality. "Then they will not take you from me," he growled. And before Elian could react, Kale lowered his head, and his teeth grazed the sensitive skin where his thumb had been. It was not a bite, not the final, binding act of a claim. It was a promise, a mark of intent, a declaration of war against his family, his society, and the very concept of fate. In that moment, Elian was no longer Unit 734. He was not Reese Valerius's intended. He was Kale's, and the storm had finally broken. The world tilted on its axis. Kale's teeth, a phantom pressure against his neck, had rewritten his biology. It was not a full claiming bite, the irreversible act that would have bound their life forces together. But it was a mark, a deep, primal declaration of intent that sent a shockwave through Elian's system. His own, scent glands, dormant and suppressed for a lifetime, flared to life, pouring the scent of moonflower and winter frost into the air, now laced with the sharp, electric tang of Kale's ozone. He was tainted, he was marked, he was no longer pure. A thrill of pure, unadulterated terror and exhilaration shot through him. Kyle released him, stepping back, his face grim, his grey eyes scanning Elian's, searching for regret, for fear. He found none, only a dawning, fierce resolve. "There is no going back," Kale stated, his voice flat. "When they discover this, they will not see an Omega who has been compromised. They will see a Valerius asset that has been stolen. They will hunt us." "Where will we go?" Elian asked, his hand instinctively going to his neck, where the skin tingled and burned. "Away from here. There are places outside the Directorate's control, free territories. They are not the paradise the rebels claim, but they are free." He moved quickly, with the economy of motion of a man long accustomed to clandestine action. He went to a panel on the wall, one that looked like a simple decorative feature, and pressed it in a specific sequence. A section of the wall slid away, revealing a dark, narrow passage. "The estate is riddled with these service tunnels, escape routes built by our more paranoid ancestors." He turned back to Elian, his gaze intense. "We have to leave. Now. Before the morning shift change. Reese will not wait until the official ceremony. He will come for you at first light." Elian looked around the opulent suite, at the silk sheets on the bed, the priceless art on the walls, the sterile perfection of the life he was about to leave behind. He felt nothing. No regret, no sense of loss. It was not his. It had never been his. He was wearing only his thin sleeping tunic. It was all he had that was truly his own. "I'm ready," he said. Kale gave him a sharp nod and handed him a dark, heavy cloak. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." The passage was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the estate. It smelled of wet stone and centuries of secrets. They moved in single file, Kyle in the lead, a small light source in his hand, casting long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their soft-soled shoes on the stone floor and the frantic beating of Elian's heart. It felt like a descent into the earth's core, a journey away from the light and order of the surface world. After what felt like an eternity, Kyle stopped, pressing his ear to the wall. He listened for a long moment before deactivating his light. The darkness was total, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed all senses. Elian felt a surge of panic, the instinct of a creature who had never known true darkness. He reached out, his hand finding Kyle's arm. The muscle was tense, hard as iron beneath the fabric of his tunic. Kyle's hand came up, covered his grip firm and reassuring. The contact was grounding, a single point of reality in the disorienting void. A section of the wall beside them groaned, scraping open. Faint moonlight filtered in, along with the scent of night air, damp earth, and pine. They were outside. Kyle led him through the opening into a dense thicket of trees. The air was cool and alive, filled with the chirping of unseen insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a symphony of sensations, overwhelming to a system accustomed to sterile silence. Elian stumbled, his feet unused to the uneven ground. Kyle's arm shot out, steadying him. "This way. I have a vehicle hidden nearby." They moved through the woods, the moon a sliver of silver through the thick canopy of leaves. The Valerius estate, visible behind them, was a constellation of cold, perfect lights, a sterile island in a sea of living darkness. It looked like a prison. The vehicle was not the sleek, silent sky skimmer of the Valerius family, but a rugged, ground-based transport, its surface matte black, designed to absorb light and sensor scans. It was a machine built for war, not for comfort. The inside was Spartan, purely functional. Kyle slid into the pilot's seat, his hands moving over the controls with practiced familiarity. The console lit up with a dim red glow, casting his face in harsh angles. "Strap in," he ordered. Elian fumbled with the restraints, his fingers clumsy. The engine hummed to life, a low, powerful thrum that vibrated through the floor of the vehicle. With a lurch, they moved forward, plunging deeper into the forest, away from the prison of light. They drove for hours in silence, the transport's advanced suspension smoothing out the rough terrain. Elian watched the wild, untamed forest flash by the armored window. He had only ever seen trees in curated gardens or on hollow screens. To see them like this, a chaotic, tangled, living mass, was both terrifying and beautiful. He was a creature of the laboratory, set loose in the wilderness. He did not know the rules. He did not know how to survive. He looked over at Kale. His profile was stark in the red glow of the console, his focus entirely on the path ahead. He was a creature of this wilderness, of shadows and secrets. Elian had placed his life, his entire future, in the hands of this grim, enigmatic man. He had chosen the war, but he did not even know who the enemy was, beyond the vague concept of the Directorate and the immediate threat of House Valerius. "Who are you, Kale?" Elian asked, the question breaking the long silence. Kale's eyes flickered toward him for a second before returning to the path. "I am the second son," he said, his voice flat. "The spare. In the Valerius equation, I was the contingency plan, genetically viable, but less compliant than Reese. My empathic sensitivity was deemed a liability. My refusal to conform, a defect. Empathic sensitivity. The term was archaic from pre-directorate psychology texts, an ability to feel the emotions of others, a flaw in a society that valued clinical detachment. They tried to train it out of me, Kale continued, his voice devoid of self-pity. When that failed, they tried to suppress it with chemicals. I learned to shield myself, to build walls of ice around my mind. They thought they had succeeded. They left me alone, a quiet, brooding failure, content to live in my brother's shadow. It was the best thing they ever did for me." He fell silent for a moment, navigating a particularly treacherous ravine. "It allowed me to watch, to learn, to see the rot at the core of our house, at the core of the whole system, and to plan. The truth you spoke of," Elian said, "it's more than just about your mother, isn't it?" Kale guided the transport into a deep, camouflage cave and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound. He turned in his seat, finally giving Elian his full attention. The red light of the console bathed them in a bloody twilight. "The fated mate bond," Kale said, his voice low and intense. "The sacred, unbreakable connection that forms the bedrock of our society. The thing you were raised to believe was your entire purpose for existing." He paused, his grey eyes locking onto Elian's. "It's a lie." The words hung in the cramped, dark space of the transport, more shocking than any physical blow. A lie. The foundation of Elian's identity, the core principle of his world, dismissed in a single, brutal syllable. He felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of profound dislocation, as if the ground beneath him had dissolved. "What? What do you mean?" he stammered, his voice thin. "It's in our biology. The compatibility, the scent recognition. The Directorate scientists proved it." "The Directorate scientists engineered it," Kale corrected, his voice merciless. "They didn't discover a natural phenomenon. They invented one. 2 generations ago, they isolated a series of dormant retroviruses in the human genome, relics of a forgotten evolutionary path. They learned how to activate them, how to code them to specific genetic markers. They created a biological lock and key system. He leaned forward, the intensity of his gaze pinning Elian to his seat. They didn't create love, Elian. They created a programmable, genetically targeted imprinting mechanism, a biological leash. They can make anyone a fated mate for anyone else. It's the ultimate tool of control. It ensures that powerful bloodlines never mix with undesirable elements. It keeps the power structure rigid and absolute. It turns people into breeding stock with the illusion of a grand, romantic destiny. The clinical precision of his explanation was horrifying. It stripped away all the poetry, all the mystique, leaving only the cold, hard mechanics of control. Elian's entire life, the years of conditioning, the sense of purpose, the belief in his sacred destiny with Reese. It was all a fabrication, a meticulously crafted piece of genetic graffiti. He was not special. He was not chosen by fate. He was programmed. He was not a person. He was a protocol. The thought echoed in his mind, a terrifying refrain. He felt a surge of nausea, a deep, visceral rejection of this truth. He thought of Reese, of his perfect, curated scent. It wasn't a sign of destiny. It was a chemical trigger, designed to elicit a specific response in Elian's engineered biology. "You were a particularly ambitious project," Kale continued, his voice relentless. "An Omega created from scratch, your genes spliced and edited to be the perfect receptacle for the next generation of Valerius leaders. Your bond with Reese would have been absolute. You would not have been able to defy him. You would have craved his approval, his touch. You would have done anything to please him. Your will would have been completely submerged by the programming." Elian closed his eyes, a strangled sound escaping his lips. It was a fate worse than a cage. It was the annihilation of the self. "Why are you telling me this?" he whispered, opening his eyes. They were filled with a despair so profound it was almost black. "Why save me only to destroy me with this?" Kale's expression softened for the first time, the hard lines of his face easing into something that looked almost like pain. His own. "Because you cannot fight an enemy you do not understand," he said, his voice quieter now. "And because you needed to know that what you felt, or didn't feel, for Reese was not a failure on your part. It was your spirit, your true self, fighting against the programming. It was the part of you they couldn't erase, the part that I saw in the presentation hall." He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them before gently, hesitantly touching Elian's cheek. His fingers were calloused, rough against Elian's smooth skin. The touch was not possessive, not a claim. It was a gesture of profound, aching tenderness. "I am not your savior, Elian," he said softly. "I am just another cage, perhaps, but I am giving you the key. What you do with your freedom, that is up to you." Elian leaned into the touch, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. The truth was a poison, but it was also the antidote. It burned, but it also cleansed. He was a lie. But if he was a lie, he could become a truth of his own making. The anger came next, a white-hot flame that burned away the despair. Anger at the Directorate, at House Valerius, at Reese. Anger for the life that had been stolen from him, for the identity that had been manufactured. The fire in his eyes seemed to satisfy Kale. He withdrew his hand, his expression once again becoming guarded, resolute. "We can rest here for a few hours. The transport is shielded from passive scans, but they will be hunting us actively by now. My father will not tolerate this defiance. Reese will not tolerate the humiliation. He will see it as a theft, Elian said, the words cold and sharp. He will not believe I chose to leave. He is incapable of believing it, Kale agreed. In his world, you do not have the capacity for choice. It will make him predictable. He will hunt for a stolen object, not a thinking enemy. The thought of Reese, of his entitled rage, sent a chill down Elian's spine. He was no longer just a suitor. He was a hunter. Elian was his prey. Kyle retrieved 2 ration packs from a storage compartment. They were dense, nutrient-rich bars that tasted of nothing. Elian ate his mechanically, his mind racing. He was a blank slate, a person who had to learn how to be a person. He had no skills, no knowledge of the real world. He was completely dependent on the man sitting beside him. "What is the plan?" Elian asked, his voice stronger now, laced with the steel of his newfound anger. "We need to get to the Outer Rim, to a city called Haven," Kale explained. "It's one of the largest free territories. I have contacts there, people who are fighting the Directorate. They can help us disappear." "And you? What will you do?" Kale was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I have a war to fight," he said finally. "Stealing you was not the end of my plan. It was the beginning. It was a message to my father that his assets are not secure, that his control is an illusion. There are others like me, inside the great houses, who are tired of the Directorate's sterile tyranny. This will be a signal to them." Elian looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a rescuer, but a revolutionary. A man willing to burn down his own world to build something new from the ashes. He had not just saved Elian from a cage, he had drawn him into his own war. The exhaustion of the escape, coupled with the devastating revelations, suddenly hit Elian like a physical blow. His body slumped against the seat, his adrenaline-fueled strength deserting him. Kale noticed the shift immediately. "Get some sleep," he said, his voice softer. "I will keep watch." Elian wanted to argue, to say he would stay awake, but his body would not obey. He closed his eyes, and the darkness swarmed him. He fell into a sleep that was not restful, but filled with fragmented images, sterile white rooms, Reese's cold smile, his mother's vacant eyes, as described by Kale, and through it all, a storm of grey eyes and the scent of ozone. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. The transport was moving. Outside the window, the grey light of dawn was filtering through the trees. Kyle was at the controls, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes alert, constantly scanning the terrain ahead. Elian felt a strange pang in his chest, a sense of connection. It was not the programmed biological pull he had been taught to expect. It was something quieter, something earned in the shared darkness of the cave. It was trust, a fragile, tentative thing. As if sensing his gaze, Kale looked over at him. "They're close," he said, his voice tight. "A patrol of skimmers passed over us an hour ago. They're sweeping the forest in a grid pattern. They know we're on the ground." Elian's blood ran cold. "Can they find us?" "This transport has a stealth system, but it's not perfect. At close range, they'll get a signature. We need to get out of this forest before they box us in." He pushed the vehicle faster, the powerful engine whining in protest as it navigated the dense woods. The ride became rougher, jarring. Elian gripped his seat, his eyes scanning the trees, half expecting a Valerius enforcer to appear at any moment. And then he saw it, a flicker of silver through the trees, a skimmer, then another. They were being herded. Kale swore under his breath, his hands flying across the control panel. "They're driving us toward the river. They'll have it blocked." He banked the transport sharply, heading in a new direction, but another skimmer appeared, cutting them off. They were trapped. A voice, amplified and distorted, boomed through the forest, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Kale Valerius, you are harboring stolen property. Surrender the asset and yourself immediately. Your cooperation will be noted." The asset, the property. The words were like a slap. Reese's voice, cold and imperious, dripped with condescending authority. "He will not stop," Elian said, his voice a dead whisper. "He will destroy this vehicle, and me with it, before he allows me to be free." "I know," Kyle said grimly. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes filled with a terrible resolve. "There is one last option. It is not a good one." He pointed ahead to where the forest thinned near a sheer cliff face. "The river is at the bottom of that gorge. If we can get across, the land on the other side is a dead zone for sensors. Volcanic rock. It will mask our trail. But the bridge—" "What about the bridge?" Elian asked, his heart sinking. "There isn't one," Kale said, his hands tightening on the controls. "Hold on." And with a roar of the engine, he aimed the heavy transport directly at the cliff's edge. The world dissolved into a chaotic blur of green and brown as Kale accelerated toward the precipice. Elian's mind went blank with terror, his body locked in place by the restraining harness. This was not an escape plan. It was suicide. The roar of the engine was a primal scream, drowning out the amplified voice of Reese, which was now laced with fury and disbelief. The edge of the cliff rushed toward them, a line between existence and oblivion. For a fraction of a second, Elian saw the vast, empty space beyond, and the silver ribbon of the river far, far below. He closed his eyes. Then came the sickening lurch of freefall. The transport plunged off the cliff, and for a heart-stopping moment, they were suspended in the air, weightless. The silence was absolute, the engine's roar replaced by the rush of wind. Elian's stomach climbed into his throat. This was it. This was the end. But instead of a catastrophic impact, there was a violent, bone-jarring jolt and the deafening shriek of stressed metal. Kale had activated the transport's emergency grav dampeners and retro thrusters. They were not designed for this, not for arresting the fall of a multi-ton vehicle. They were a last-ditch system to soften a crash. The transport plummeted, its descent slowed, but still terrifyingly fast. Warning lights flashed across the console, and a synthesized voice began a calm, monotonous litany of system failures. Gravitic integrity at 50%, hull breach imminent, main power failing. Through the armored window, Elian saw the canyon walls rushing past, a vertical blur of rock and scrub. The river grew closer, a churning, white-water torrent. Kale fought with the controls, his face a mask of concentration, sweat beading on his forehead. He was not trying to land. He was aiming. With a final, desperate surge from the dying engine, he angled the transport's nose upward, turning their plummet into a long, desperate glide. They shot across the river, clearing the rapids by a few terrifying meters. And then the power gave out completely. The transport slammed into the opposite bank with the force of an artillery shell. The impact was brutal. Elian's head was thrown forward, stopped only by the harness, his teeth rattling in his skull. The world went black for a moment, then returned in a haze of pain and disorientation. The transport groaned, the sound of tortured metal crying out its death agony as it slid back down the muddy bank, coming to rest half in, half out of the raging water. Silence descended, broken only by the rush of the river and the hiss of escaping steam. "Elian." Kyle's voice was rough, strained. "Are you all right?" Elian took a ragged breath, a sharp pain lancing through his ribs. "I think so." He looked over. Kyle was slumped against the console, a dark trickle of blood running from a cut on his temple. But his eyes were clear, alert. He was already unbuckling his harness. "We have to get out. The hull is compromised. It will flood." The door on Elian's side was jammed, crumpled by the impact. Kyle kicked at his own door, the hinges screaming in protest before it finally gave way, opening onto a world of mud and churning water. He scrambled out, then turned, reaching back in for Elian. "Come on. We have to move before they cross the river." Elian unbuckled his harness, his body screaming in protest. Every muscle ached. He crawled over the central console, his movements clumsy. Kyle's hand closed around his arm, his grip strong, and he pulled Elian from the wreckage. The air was cold, heavy with the spray of the river. Rain began to fall, a fine, chilling mist. They were on a narrow, muddy bank at the base of the cliffs. On the far side, they could see the silver skimmers hovering at the edge like frustrated predators. They had no way to cross, not quickly. "They will call for ground troops," Kale said, his voice grim. "But it will take time. We have a head start." He pulled Elian up the bank, away from the dying transport and into the cover of a strange, petrified forest. The trees here were black, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes. It was the volcanic dead zone he had spoken of. The ground was covered in a layer of fine, black ash. Kyle paused, leaning against one of the dead trees, his breathing heavy. The cut on his head was bleeding more freely now, the blood starkly red against his pale skin. Elian tore a strip of fabric from the hem of his tunic. "Let me," he said, his voice quiet. Kyle watched him, his expression unreadable, as Elian gently cleaned the wound and tied the strip of cloth around his head as a makeshift bandage. His fingers were steady. In the space of a single night, he had gone from a sheltered specimen to a survivor. The transformation was far from complete, but it had begun. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt of awareness passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared ordeal, their shared desperation. "Thank you," Kyle murmured, his voice low. He looked back across the river at the distant lights of his past, of the world that had created and caged them both. A muscle worked in his jaw. "My father will disown me. Reese will put a bounty on my head so large that every mercenary in the territories will be hunting us." "I am sorry," Elian said, and he meant it. He had not asked for Kale to sacrifice his life, his legacy. "Don't be," Kale said, turning to face him fully. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his grey eyes were the color of the storm clouds gathering above them. "I have been a ghost in that house for 20 years. I have been at war with them in my mind for just as long. This is just the first time the battle has become real." He started walking again, his pace steady despite his injury. "Haven is a week's journey on foot from here, if we are lucky. We have no food, no supplies, and we will be hunted. The odds are not in our favor." Elian fell into step beside him. The black ash crunched under his feet. He looked at their surroundings, at the stark, brutal beauty of the dead forest. It was a world of black and grey, a world stripped of all color and comfort. It should have been terrifying. But as he looked at the determined set of Kyle's shoulders, at the man who had thrown himself and his world off a cliff for a chance at freedom, he did not feel fear. He felt a strange, fierce hope. "Then we had better not rely on luck," Elian said. Kyle stopped, turning to him in surprise. A slow, faint smile touched his lips for the first time. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it transformed his severe face, hinting at a warmth hidden deep beneath the ice. "No," Kyle agreed, the smile fading, replaced by his usual grim resolve. "We will not." They walked on, two solitary figures moving through a dead landscape under a weeping sky, leaving the wreckage of their past behind them. The hunt was on. The war had begun, and in the heart of the storm, they had only each other. The journey through the volcanic dead zone was a brutal education in the realities of survival. The world Elian had known was one of soft textures, controlled temperatures, and readily available nourishment. This new world was sharp, cold, and unforgiving. The fine black ash worked its way into his clothes, his lungs, his very pores, a constant gritty reminder of their desolation. The petrified trees offered no shelter from the relentless, drizzling rain. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in his belly. Thirst was a fire in his throat. Kyle was a relentless, silent teacher. He showed Elian how to find water, small, clean trickles seeping from fissures in the volcanic rock. He taught him to move silently, to use the terrain for cover, to read the sky for changes in the weather. He pushed them onward, his pace punishing, driven by the knowledge that they were being hunted. Elian's body, honed for aesthetic perfection, not for endurance, protested. His muscles screamed. His feet became a mass of blisters. But his spirit did not break. With every painful step, he felt himself shedding the last vestiges of Unit 734. He was being forged in this crucible of hardship, the soft, pliable material of his former self being burned away, leaving something harder, more resilient, in its place. They spoke little. Words were a luxury they could not afford, their energy reserved for the grueling trek. But in the silence, a new form of communication developed between them. A shared glance, a subtle gesture, a slight shift in posture. Elian learned to read the tension in Kyle's shoulders, to know when he sensed danger. Kyle learned to recognize the faint tremor of exhaustion in Elian's hands, to know when he needed to rest, even if he would not admit it. They were becoming a unit, forged not by programming or destiny, but by shared adversity. On the third day, they saw their hunters. They were crouched in a narrow ravine, taking a brief rest, when Kyle suddenly stiffened, pulling Elian down behind a rock outcropping. He pointed to the sky. High above, almost invisible against the grey clouds, were two specks, not the sleek Valerius skimmers, but something else. Vulture drones, military-grade reconnaissance units. "Reese isn't relying on house enforcers anymore," Kyle whispered, his voice grim. "He's hired professionals, mercenaries." The drones moved in a slow, sweeping pattern, their optical sensors methodically scanning the landscape below. Elian held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt utterly exposed, a helpless insect under the gaze of a predator. The drones passed over them, their sensors unable to penetrate the thick rock of the ravine. But the message was clear. There was no escape. They were being relentlessly stalked. The encounter changed the dynamic of their journey. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was a tangible, hovering presence. They traveled only at night now, resting during the day in caves or deep crevasses, any place that offered cover from the sky. The darkness, which had once terrified Elian, became his ally. Sleep offered little respite. Elian's dreams were a chaotic tempest of his past and present. He dreamt of the white room, but now its walls were covered in black ash. He dreamt of Reese, but his sky-blue eyes were the cold, dead lenses of a vulture drone. He would wake with a gasp, his body slick with cold sweat, the scent of ozone and stone from the man sleeping a few feet away, the only thing that anchored him to reality. One night, huddled in a shallow cave, against a wind that carried the first bite of true winter, Elian woke from a particularly vivid nightmare. He was shivering, not entirely from the cold. Kyle was awake, sitting near the mouth of the cave, a dark silhouette against the starless sky. He was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone the only sound. Bad dream? Kyle asked without turning around. His empathic sensitivity, Elian realized. He could feel the echoes of his terror. I dreamt I was back there, Elian said, his voice husky, in the white room. But you were there too. You were trying to break the glass, but you couldn't. And Reese was laughing. Kyle stopped sharpening the knife. He turned his head, his profile stark and severe. It was just a dream. Was it? Elian asked, pulling his thin cloak tighter around himself. What if we don't make it to Haven? What if he finds us? He won't just take me back, will he? He'll punish you. He'll kill you. The raw fear in his own voice surprised him. The thought of Kyle being hurt, being killed, was a physical pain in his chest. Kyle put down the knife and moved to sit beside him. The space in the small cave was tight, and their shoulders brushed. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through Elian's cold body. He can try, Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes searching his face in the dim light. Are you sorry you came with me? If you had stayed, you would be safe. You would be warm. You would have everything you were ever promised. I would be nothing, Elian said, his voice fierce with conviction. I would be an object, a beautiful, empty shell, just like you said. He met Kale's gaze without flinching. I would rather die out here as myself than live 1,000 years as that thing. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind. Kyle's expression was intense, a storm of emotions swirling in the depths of his eyes. He raised Akohu's hand, as he had in the transport, and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from Elian's forehead. The gesture was incredibly tender, a stark contrast to the harsh world around them, to the harsh man he pretended to be. My mother would have liked you, Kyle said, his voice thick with an emotion Elian could not name. His hand lingered, his thumb stroking Elian's temple. Elian's breath caught. His heart, which had been pounding with fear, now pounded with something else entirely. Something new and terrifying and wonderful. This connection, this feeling. It was not programmed. It was not a biological imperative. It was real. It had been forged in darkness and defiance, in shared pain and quiet understanding. He leaned into the touch, a silent surrender. Kyle's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to Elian's lips. The air in the cave grew thick, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with the hunt and everything to do with the two of them. The distance between them vanished. Kale's lips met his, and the world fell away. The kiss was not gentle. It was rough, desperate, freighted with all the fear and loss and unspoken longing that had passed between them. It was the taste of rain and stone, the heat of a fire in the heart of a winter storm. It was a claiming, not of an asset, but of an equal, a recognition, a vow. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. Kale rested his forehead against Elian's, his eyes closed. Elian, he breathed, his voice ragged. It was not a name. It was a prayer. In that moment, in that desolate cave, surrounded by enemies and a world that wanted to destroy them, Elian felt, for the first time in his life, completely and utterly safe. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was not a lie. He was Elian. And he was home. The intimacy of the kiss, the raw, unguarded moment of connection in the cave, changed everything. The harsh realities of their journey remained: the hunger, the cold, the ever-present threat of capture. But now they were threaded with a new, resilient strand of something that felt like hope. A silent understanding passed between them. There were no declarations, no promises of a future they might not live to see. There was only the present, the shared glances that now held a deeper meaning, the brief touches that lingered, a hand on an arm to steady him, fingers brushing as they passed a piece of scavenged food. It was a language of its own, spoken in the quiet spaces of their desperate flight. They finally left the volcanic dead zone behind, crossing into a region of sparse, windswept plains. The cover of the petrified forest was gone, leaving them terrifyingly exposed. But the ground was softer, and there was more life here. Small, hardy plants clung to the earth, and they saw signs of animal life. It was a sign that they were getting closer to the edge of the Directorate's controlled territories. Their progress was faster now, but so was the hunt. The mercenary presence intensified. They were no longer just facing aerial surveillance. One evening, as they were making their way through a rocky canyon, Kyle, who was scouting ahead, suddenly signaled for Elian to get down. Elian dropped behind a cluster of boulders, his heart leaping into his throat. Kyle crept back to him, his face a grim mask. "Patrol," he mouthed, pointing down the canyon. Peeking through a gap in the rocks, Elian saw them. 3 figures in mottled grey combat gear, moving with the quiet, deadly efficiency of professional soldiers. They carried pulse rifles, their black snouts sweeping the area. They were close, too close. They were trapped. The canyon offered no other exit. To go back would be to expose themselves on the open plains. Kale drew his knife, the only weapon he had. The mercenaries were methodically checking every shadow, every overhang. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Kale looked at Elian, his eyes communicating a silent, terrible message. He was preparing to fight, to die, to buy Elian a few precious seconds to run. Elian shook his head. A minute, desperate gesture. He would not leave him. He would not run. His gaze darted around their small hiding place, searching for anything, any advantage. His eyes fell on a section of the canyon wall above the approaching mercenaries. It was a mess of loose rock and scree, barely clinging to the cliff face. An idea, born of sheer desperation, sparked in his mind. He looked at Kale and then pointed up at the unstable rock face. Kale followed his gaze, and his eyes widened slightly as he understood. It was a long shot, a suicidal, desperate gamble, but it was their only shot. Kale gave a single, sharp nod. He pointed to himself, then to a narrow ledge further up the canyon wall, a path that would take him above the patrol. Then he pointed at Elian, and then at the ground. A clear command to stay put, to not move, no matter what. Elian nodded, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched as Kyle, with the silent grace of a predator, began to climb, using the small handholds and footholds in the rock face, melting into the shadows. He was a ghost against the stone. Elian pressed himself flat against the ground, making himself as small as possible, trying to control his ragged breathing. The mercenaries were getting closer. He could hear the crunch of their boots on the gravel, the faint electronic hum of their equipment. They were 10 meters away. 5. One of them stopped, his helmeted head turning, his rifle raising slightly as he scanned the very rocks Elian was hiding behind. Elian's blood ran cold. He was sure he had been seen. He braced himself for the searing pain of a pulse blast, and then, from high above, came a sound, a single, sharp crack of a rock striking rock. It was a small sound, but in the quiet canyon, it was as loud as a gunshot. The 3 mercenaries spun around, their rifles swinging up toward the Teague, source of the noise. It was the distraction, the lure. "Up there," one of them shouted. As they trained their weapons on the ledge where Kyle had disappeared, a low rumble began. It started as a whisper, a trickle of pebbles, and then grew with terrifying speed into a roar. The unstable cliff face Elian had spotted gave way. An avalanche of rock and earth thundered down into the canyon, directly onto the spot where the mercenaries were standing. It was over in seconds. A cloud of dust filled the air, and then silence, broken only by the trickle of a few remaining pebbles. Elian lay frozen for a long moment, his ears ringing. Then he heard a soft sound nearby and looked up. Kale was sliding down a scree slope, his face covered in dust, but he was alive. He was alive. Elian scrambled out from behind the rocks, his legs weak with relief. Kale met him, grabbing his arms, his eyes scanning him for injuries. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with dust and tension. Elian could only nod, unable to speak. "That was your plan," Kale said, a note of awe in his voice. "You saw that. You directed me." He looked at Elian, not as a fragile Omega he needed to protect, but as a partner, an equal. Elian started, his voice trembling. "I just saw it. I didn't know if it would work." "It worked," Kyle said, his grip on Elian's arms tightening. He pulled him close, a rough, desperate embrace. Elian buried his face in Kale's shoulder, breathing in his scent, the familiar ozone and stone now mixed with the dust of the earth. They had survived. Together. But they both knew this was an escalation. They hadn't just evaded a patrol, they had eliminated it. Reese would not see this as the act of a desperate fugitive. He would see it as an act of war. The response would be swift and merciless. "We can't rest," Kyle said, pulling away, his face once again a mask of grim determination. "They will know something is wrong when this patrol misses its check-in. They will send everything they have." They took the mercenaries' gear. 2 pulse rifles, a med kit, and most importantly, several nutrient-rich ration packs and water canteens. Kyle checked the rifles, his movements economical and sure. He handed one to Elian. It was heavy, cold, and felt utterly alien in his hands. "Do you know how to use this?" Kale asked. Elian shook his head. He had been taught etiquette and genetics, not warfare. Kale spent a precious few minutes showing him the basics, the safety, the charging mechanism, the sighting system. "Don't use it unless you have to," Kyle instructed. "But if you have to, don't hesitate. Aim for the center of mass, and don't stop firing until they are down." The cold, brutal instructions were another sign of how their world had changed. Elian nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped the weapon. He was no longer just the prey. Now he was armed. Now he could fight back. They left the canyon, moving at a punishing pace, the weight of their stolen gear a heavy burden. But the food and water gave them new strength. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across the plains, they found a defensible position in a small, rocky tor. They would rest for a few hours and then press on. As Kyle took the first watch, Elian cleaned the pulse rifle, mimicking the movements he had seen Kyle perform. The simple, mechanical task focused his mind. He was no longer the same person who had left the Valerius estate. That person was a stranger, a ghost from another life. He had been born in a sterile room, but he was coming alive out here, in the dirt and the danger. He looked over at Kale, who stood on the edge of the rocks, a silent sentinel watching the horizon. He had offered Elian a choice, a war he might not survive, but he had also given him something he never knew he was missing: a self, a purpose, a partner. He did not know if they would make it to Haven. He did not know if they would survive the night. But as he looked at the man who was his storm, his shelter, and his hope, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let Reese take this from him. He would fight. He would die if he had to. But he would never, ever be a cage bird again.